We are live.
Hello.
Hey, good afternoon,
Good
everybody. Good afternoon, Fati.
afternoon. Good afternoon, Rick. We made it. We didn't get caught half sentence.
Yes,
We're
yes.
pros now.
Or 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 right in the middle of our setup.
Yes. Me trying to oh, you know what? Actually, we may be right in the middle of our setup.
Really?
Because guess what?
Oh, well, you're sounding okay.
We'll do this without anyone noticing.
Okay. Hi, Shelley. Good. Thank you for joining us today. Good afternoon. Um, yeah, no, it's good to see. It's been a busy kind of week, at least from on my end, and you know, it's funny how we prepare for the show. It, and I kind of recall a little bit about what we were talking about in paramedicine about the first few minutes of the call kind of dictates how the rest of things are going to go, right?
What are you trying to say, Rick?
I am just say we're going to have a lot of fun, right?
We are. We're going to have a lot of fun talking about boundaries, right?
Oh, and yes, and the whole that and how we see it so differently sometimes.
How was it? Yeah, let's get into that, right? Because this topic came up last week when you and I, at the end of the show, were talking about what should we talk about next week, and boundaries came up, and you and I had a very different reaction to that, right? Do you want to go into what your reaction was?
No, nothing's right or wrong. It's just our experience with it. But yeah, no, well, we it's interesting because we share different backgrounds, right? Obviously, I mean, there are 7+ billion different points of view out there. Um, but when I heard boundaries, the first thing that come up in my mind was restriction,
Rules.
rules. And you know what Vision says about rules, right?
Rules, exactly.
Yeah. So
Hi, Shelley, by the way. Good afternoon.
yes, and good to see the people from Mind Valley here too. The so that's the first thing that came up, right? Was this idea of boundaries, boxes, kind of a thing. And one of the things from my coaching perspective is that I want to break boundaries. I want to break the box, so to speak.
Hmm.
Um, and I'll get into some of the philosophy and some of the things that came up, but from so when you brought boundaries forward, what were you thinking about
Yeah,
that?
so so I want to speak a little bit to what you just said because that's kind of what you expressed to me, right? And I was like, oh, who's more freer than me, right? I'm like a rule breaker. I don't like to be boxed into anything, right? That's
Mhm.
very much my personality.
Yeah, yeah,
And yet, having boundaries in my relationships feels safe to me, feels like it gives me some guidelines, right? It gives me a place where I know, where I start and where others end, and vice versa, right? So to me, it felt really safe. And then as we went on talking about this, and we're like, we wish we had recorded this, but we'll do it again next week.
well, let's hope we can do it again next week.
We're doing it again. So as we kept talking about it, what came up was that it's really a little bit the weight that's being put on the word itself, right? The label. Like we talk about labels a lot, right? And how one word that can feel super empowering to someone can feel very disempowering to somebody else, or can be very triggering, frankly,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, absolutely.
And in this case, you felt triggered by the word boundary because you saw it as very restrictive. And I saw it as very freeing, right? It gives me freedom because now I know where I stand. I know, once I have set those boundaries and made clear, what is acceptable is not, and it's not acceptable to me. I put it out there, and it serves as an agreement for me, as a guideline, right? And what is okay for me and what is not, right? But the
Hmm.
way you were experiencing that word was very different, right? And so what we decided that we're going to do instead was we're going to talk about boundaries in terms of what they can really do, right? And leave the label out, leave the label boundaries out, because it is kind of a strong word, to be honest, right?
Yeah,
It
it's
feels very like boxing, like you were saying.
well, the word bound, right? You're
Yeah,
bound, right? So what
yeah,
does it mean to be bound? It means to be tied to or something, right? So yeah, I mean, it is a label. And when I was expressing my thoughts about it last week, I could sense where it was really coming from, because it wasn't necessarily the boundaries or the guidelines. Let's call them guidelines, or
guidelines, yeah. And then we
or
said there are
there
more
were
guidelines, right?
um, because that is a more of a looser term, is guidelines, right? If we go for the actual definition of boundaries, we're talking about limits and rules,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So so that's where it becomes tricky, because if we're truly talking about boundaries, then we're actually talking about, okay, so what is our limit, and what are my rules of
Mm-hmm.
engagement, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some of the negative things that were coming up for me was not so much the ones I was putting on myself, but the ones that I was hearing from others, on what I should be, like what limits they were putting on me, like what rules they were putting
Mm-hmm.
on me. And I was sharing this morning, with a group about, when I was in school, and this is like really young. We were learning math. We were learning, things about that. And one of the tools they were using for math was these square rectangles, sticks, and some were cubes and some were of various lengths, but they were rectangle, and they were all uniformed in shape. And the idea was to put tens together, so taking all the different shapes, but each unit was one, and then you could find a five and a one, and then find a four unit and make 10. And we all had the same amount of sticks, and the idea was to make as many tens as you wanted.
Mm-hmm.
That was all I was told. Make as many tens as you could. And so I did. And so I would take the five one and put the five one together. That was 10. I'd take a four and a six, and do all that. Well, I started to run out of the ones. And I looked at these long sticks, because they were uniform around. I turned them, I stood them up, and
Mm-hmm.
fit them in the hole. So I, from my point of view, it made a unit, even though I was thinking outside the box.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't give me any limits. They didn't give me any rules about it. So I stood these sticks up. Well, the teacher comes up and looks at it and goes, "Oh, I'm fascinated about your idea for that." And I remember, feeling really good. She says, "That's really creative of you," right? And then she brought another adult over, and the adult, sort of like, I don't know who these. I know one was my teacher, and said the same thing. Well, next week we have the same sort of exercise. Hey, it worked last week, right?
I'm gonna do it
Let's
again.
do it again. And I did it, but it was a different teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And that teacher said, "That's not what you're supposed to do." That, started to, sort of like, my creativity all of a sudden didn't become creative anymore. It became something
Mm-hmm.
different. And, it's like, so all of a sudden I started to realize there there's rules to this game, right? And I've what was freeing all of a sudden become quite restrictive. So that to me meant boundaries. It was sort of like,
Mm-hmm.
well, you didn't tell me what the boundaries were. Here I am, fully expressing myself, and all of a sudden I come up with something that's a boundary, and it puts me back two steps.
Yeah. So do you see how this one word has so much meaning for you?
Oh,
It brings up
totally.
all these experiences from the past, right? Your
Yeah,
upbringing, and it has a very negative connotation.
sure.
So
And
yeah, often I feel like, this is a very important point to make. It's more useful to look at, the meaning or the use of these definitions, right, rather than the word itself,
Yeah.
right? Because the word itself can be very triggering, can feel very limiting. It is kind of a strong word, right? Boundaries feels more like barriers, right? And
Oh,
boundaries, by the way, become barriers when they're like very fixed and non-flexible. That's
mm,
when they become barriers. We'll get into that in a minute because that's kind of the risk that you run if you're too strict with your boundaries, is that they're no longer just boundaries, but they're literally, you're just blocking things off, right? You're not allowing creativity, like kind of like what you were just sharing. In this instance, the second teacher was run by the boundaries, was not setting the boundaries were running the teacher, right? And
yeah.
that's the risk that you run into if you're too strict with them, that you no longer are the one setting them, but you're being, limited by them,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And and at the same time, like I want to share some of my experience and why that
Sure.
felt
Yep.
really good for me. That why, like, just this, I felt like I discovered boundaries in my adulthood, right? Because some of these concepts were never taught to me, or were never modeled for me, where I never really, no one ever explained any of this stuff to me, right?
Right.
And so when I learned that setting boundaries was more about what is okay for me and what it's not, that it kind of took me to do that introspective work, reflective work on myself, and defining what is okay, what is not, defining what feels good and what doesn't feel good. That it wasn't really about blocking others, was about kind of stating where I stand, if that makes any sense, right? Stating even to myself, right? And I always say the boundaries, the first boundaries, if you are not someone who has ever thought about this in these terms, right? Or actively set boundaries, the first boundaries that you're is useful for you to set are the ones with yourself, right? And then you can start using them in your relationships, because we often don't even set boundaries with ourselves, right? With work, we overwork ourselves, we don't take care of ourselves, right? Those are like, let's not call them boundaries, guidelines, right? I
Okay.
know that if I do, right, because I can see you like boundaries. Okay, so let's call them guidelines, right? Like I do reflective work where I realize that for me, what I need to be healthy and to stay in a good state of being, I need to work out once a week, twice a week, or I need to eat healthy. I need to take breaks every 9 minutes, whatever it is that you have realized about yourself, right? So
Mhm.
I realize that those are healthy habits for me to have, right? And in order to continue to have those habits, I have to kind of be reminded of them, remind myself of them, right?
Mhm.
And set some boundaries around when there's a part of me that wants to kind of work, 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 push, 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 and ignore all the things that I know are good for myself, right? So that's a good place to start setting boundaries with yourself, right? Every day I'm going to make sure that I will stop and eat, right? Very basic. Your boundaries can be very, very basic, and you can really start small from easy things to work on. So the first boundaries, in my opinion, are the boundaries that you set with yourself and that you respect, that you learn to respect for yourself.
Mhm.
Because guess what? Whatever we do to ourselves is what gets reflected back out, right? How
And
we treat ourselves is how we treat others,
yeah.
right? So if you want to test this out, start testing it out with yourself. Can you hold a boundary for yourself, right? And then but now when I go
And
back to
that,
why they go ahead. Sorry.
I just want to highlight that one point though, because that you're bang on. And I sometimes joke about, when was the last time you attended your own lecture,
Exactly.
right? And and if you can't honor your own guidelines, how are you to expect others to do,
Exactly.
right? So yeah, no, important point. Thanks for bringing that.
Exactly. So the other thing that, and we'll get into the expectations versus making agreements, right? Because they're strict, they're very related,
Yeah.
right, in our relationships. So the reason why they felt really good for me is because growing up, I feel like my rules were Like, and we had this debate, right? I was like, yeah, I had, like a strict upbringing too. It's just that the rules were shifting based on what was convenient in my case, right? So there were rules, but those rules were being modified, as it was convenient, right? And I never felt like I could stand on firm ground. Like I never felt like I ever knew how to be, because I knew I had some rules, but those rules could change any day or they would apply the next day, right? So
Yeah.
it was very confusing to me. And so that's why it feels good to me to know exactly what is okay, what is not okay, what are some things that I'm willing to compromise on, and what are some things that I'm not willing to compromise on. And that's actually a very important point, right?
Hmm.
Just because you're setting a boundary doesn't mean that's just like set in stone, right? Well, this is my comfort zone, and there's a little wiggle room where I can compromise on certain things. And that when we get into talking about relationships, that's all relationships are, right? Understanding we're each standing, and kind of compromising, because we're not all the same, right? So
Correct.
that piece of flexibility and compromise has to be there. You can't have that and have a healthy relationship, because it's not going to be balanced, right? It's going to be swaying one way or the other based on who is more willing to be people pleasing or giving in, right? And that's where problems start. So yeah, so that's why, the word when I discovered boundaries, and I discovered that I kept my entire life, I've kept being disappointed because I had expectations from people, and they were not being met.
Hmm.
Then I realized, oh, well, all I have to do is establish what is okay for me, right? Live by it, and
Hmm.
then instead of expecting things, voice what feels good to me, and make an agreement, compromise on where can we meet? How can we be in this relationship together to where it feels safe for both of us? It feels that we're there's balance.
Yeah. Yeah. It's and it's funny how it does creep into relationships. And I know we've had a few comments of, of people in our little groupie um, uh,
Yeah, we have quite a
subscriber.
few questions
Yeah, yeah.
about this. Yeah,
But relationships is a good topic, and of
yeah.
course, relate. You know, I think the top couple are always about the issues around money and the issues around relationships, right? Are always on people's minds all the time. Um, One of the things I was reflecting on when it comes to, and I'm going to keep using the word boundaries for now, is, and you're kind of hinting on it from my reflective point, is when I'm feeling things aren't right. So there's a feeling within me that's surfacing, and I'm looking at it from my point of view. I'm making it sort of like I is that my fear is that a boundary has a way of trying to control outside circumstances.
Hmm.
So something's rubbing up against me. Something is not feeling right. And this is just something I've been reflecting on and playing with is, okay, if it truly is an inside out, and that the world is being reflected, so something's rubbing up against me. If I am doing something to try and control the outside circumstances, am I missing something here inside me?
Can I challenge that?
I go, yeah, no, that's what we're here for, right? And anybody that has comments or other questions or anything like, please feel free to use the chat function either
Absolutely,
on
yes.
Facebook
Put them in the
or on
chat.
YouTube.
I was looking for them actually. I was not paying attention. I was looking for the questions because I would like to answer some of them.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
I want to challenge what you just said just a little bit, because
sure.
what I'm
No,
still hearing and what you're saying is that there's resistance. right? You feel the resistance part of boundaries, and you feel the rules constrictive part of boundaries,
Not
right?
just
Because
yeah.
control to me is the same vibration of, like rules, and like, to me is the same vibration. That's the way I see control, is like something that is imposed, that's, that's not in flow, that it's not fluid, right?
It only from the point of me trying to control something outside of my control. So
Okay.
if I
So
yeah, if I feel that the way I can control my world better
mhm,
is by creating a bunch of rules and limits and things like that. If I think I can control my world better that way, knowing that I can't control the world, um, Lord knows I've tried. Um,
we all have.
right, but the only thing I can do is control my thinking, and
Yeah.
and so that's the only thing, is from what point of view am I creating a boundary or creating a need? I understand what you're referring to. I am just more sort of making more aware of where am I coming from when I'm trying to make a rule or a boundary.
Okay. So I'm going to challenge that by saying, what if it wasn't about the rules? What if it was just about knowing what feels right for you,
Well,
right?
totally. Well, that's
Because
yeah, I agree.
ultimately, the way we experience life is the way it feels to us, right? So knowing what feels good for you, what
Yeah,
feels right for you,
yeah.
is important. Let's just remove completely the word boundaries, right? Let's
Well,
just talk about this in terms
we
of,
we can't. That our show is about boundaries.
oh no, well, but that's, we can do whatever we want with it, right? It's unscripted. It's unscripted.
Oh,
We're gonna
absolutely.
do, we're gonna do whatever we want with it to make the
So we're
point,
not
right?
we're
So
not bound to the
we're
topic then. Okay,
we're
this
not bound to the word. We're bound to the concept,
all right.
right?
Yeah,
And how can they serve us, and how they can be unhealthy,
yeah,
right? So it sounds like very much that the unhealthy part that you're speaking to, I'm
yes.
sure you're not the only one that feels that way. I think that feels, you listen, I have friends that have boundaries all over the place, and those boundaries feel like blocks, right? They feel like they're doing this,
Yeah. Oh,
right?
yeah. Yeah.
So I get it, right? But I want to see if we can just remove that word completely and see the value in really knowing what feels right for you and what feels in flow for you, right?
And you're pointing to a really good where exactly is knowing you,
Knowing yourself,
knowing
yes.
you, right?
Okay.
And 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 that's what I call about, like, when I notice that there's some rubs coming up, right? Like there's some friction, there's some angst, some whatever it is that's surfacing. I just know it's from me, not
Well,
from the surface.
you're getting triggered. Yeah, you're getting triggered
Yeah,
somewhere in there, right?
sure.
And
Yeah,
at the same time, knowing yourself is amazing,
yeah.
right? But when we're interacting with the world outside of ourselves, you have to state that. You have to make that known. You have to somehow show up in a way that feels right for you, right? And I
Feels
think
right.
what often happens that creates issues in relationships is that we just show up as ourselves, even if we did all this work knowing what feels right for ourselves, and then we expect everybody else to just read minds, to just know that this is what feels right for me. It's like, no, no one is a mind reader, right? And we all have a different view of the world. We all have different
Perfect.
perspectives,
They
right?
all
So
have preferences. Yeah,
what may feel right for me, I'm just gonna, if I assume that's exactly what feels right for you, that's where we're getting trouble, right?
yeah,
Because we know what feels right for ourselves, but we don't state it, right? We don't make it clear. We
yeah.
don't show up, like just owning it and like being clear about it. And it, to me, when you set some guidelines and you state what feels right for you, right, you're creating that clarity for others, right? So not only serves you, it serves them too, because now you are cutting out all of the misunderstandings, all of the mind readings, all of the like, like even, I think we often get disappointed by our expectations not being met. We get angry. We create stories in our heads, right? Or why that person said that or did that or didn't do that or didn't think of that, right? I'm not feeling well. They didn't even call me. And it's like, well, maybe they don't even know you're not feeling well, right? So we have all these expectations. And I think that that's where these guidelines, stating them, creates more harmonious relationships, helps others, gives others a map to us, right? So we're looking at what is our blueprint, what is the map to ourselves, what feels right, what doesn't feel right, where do I get triggered? And I love that you point that, I love how you always point yourself back to yourself, right? If I'm getting triggered, well, why am I getting triggered? What is this triggering in me, right? So
Right.
we're constantly, if you do the inner work, you're constantly doing that work of mapping yourself,
Yeah.
by discovering yourself and understanding what feels right, what doesn't feel right. When you're in a relationship, you kind of have to put your cards out a little bit, right? Because otherwise you're in it on your own. And
Well,
that's where it becomes a little bit tricky.
and that's what sometimes we forget in relationships, is that everybody has their own point of view, right?
Yeah.
And I get a bit of a tickle, so hopefully it won't get in the way too much. The
Don't get me sick, please.
No, I won't cough on you. um it's the butterfly effect, eh? When Rick coughs on the west coast of Canada, there's a tornado that happens in New
And
York.
please do not go offline.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, 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 no. But it's interesting how sometimes even getting mixed up in, well, getting back to the communications and the point of view, like we're all experiencing life differently,
Yeah.
and we forget that, and we forget that we all have our uniqueness within us, right? Because we're all been, if you were brought up in the same household, we all have different perspectives of what was happening.
Absolutely.
If you talk to my brother, he's got a whole different experience of growing up in the same, with the same parents in the same house, right? um,
Yeah. Same for us.
and
Yeah.
it's interesting. It's so interesting, right? Um, where he had felt there was no boundaries. I felt like
Hmm.
there was a lot of boundaries. Um,
Hmm.
and then there's the stories behind that. But you're absolutely correct around communicating, right? Like there's so, although we talk about it so much, like, oh, you got to communicate, you got to get. Why is there such a reluctance to even share our preferences, share, our likes and dislikes, and you know, or when things are just, like
I mean, it goes back to the same couple things, right? The good old, what is everyone gonna think of me, right?
yeah,
Fear of being judged,
being judged.
rejected,
Yeah,
right? I'm not good enough, right? Maybe what I'm saying is not being taken, but like we get into our stories of it,
yeah.
where every place where we're insecure, now we're just reflecting it onto that, right?
Yeah.
Instead of letting it be what it is, right? Just
So this is
stating,
where, I guess this is
right?
where my challenge comes, because this is like, and let's talk about this, is the notion that boundaries are the answer,
I don't think the boundaries are the answer. I think boundaries are a part of it.
a part of it. Okay.
Yes. I don't think boundaries, and we said we are going to throw that word away.
I know. Well, I did. You notice I don't have
Okay.
it. I don't have it on the topic right now.
Because the moment that we started talking about it in terms of stating what feels right, your whole demeanor changed. And you will rewatch this and you will notice it too,
Oh yeah.
right? That's the power of labels and words, right?
Oh,
When words are triggering to you, it's much easier to just find a word that means the same thing that feels right for you.
and
Sometimes it really solves it.
well, it is, and here's another live example, right? Of and I'm going to watch it back. It's going to be fun fun to do that. But you're absolutely correct, right? There are things that we all get surfaced or triggered from that changes, and here we go again, that clouds your view of what the world really looks like.
We love this prop.
Oh, I love that prop, and my snow globe, which I'll but
In a
but
minute.
but it's but again, it's sort of like I could see how I was I was standing on my bound. I was sorry for using the word, but I was standing on my definition of what that
Yeah,
word meant to me. I was
yeah.
standing on it, right? And then when I got challenged about it, right, when the perception of being challenged about it, um, then it's like, oh, it's a threat. Oh, you're gonna do what
I'm
to this?
sorry.
Like, right?
You're
My
going to take
ego
that
is
away
going.
from me. These
Oh, my ego is
really
going.
horrible rules. You're going to make them nice?
It's so funny
Yeah.
how I mean, it's a human thing. It's a
It's
human
a
thing.
human thing. And again, I really invite people when they get, I think I talked about on the show once before about a coaching session where someone was super triggered by the word massive action, to
Okay.
the point that she was completely frozen. She could not do anything. And the moment that we removed that label, we called it something else, connected it to her why, and connected it to all the reasons why it made sense to take those actions without them being massive, right? Being meaningful actions, then she got unlocked,
Mm.
right? She got unblocked and she was able to move past that, right? And I think this is kind of a similar example. And I have words like that are for me like boundaries are for you that really trigger me as well, right? So just for
Any hint?
clarity,
Any
there's
hint of what?
nothing wrong with Rick. We all have these, we have
Absolutely.
words that trigger us, right? And some people that are listening may feel very triggered by the word boundaries because they may feel like standoffish, right? So I invite you, not you, first of all, you don't have to go to your spouse, to your friend, to your, boss and be like, I'm setting some boundaries. You
Yeah.
don't even have to use the word. You can just gently let them know what feels right for you. And I would always say when you have that conversation, when you're about to state those boundaries, always talk about you and how you feel. Never use the word you, never point the finger, because when you get in the blaming game and pointing fingers, that's when the other person closes off
Well,
and
yeah.
no longer hears what you have to
We're
say.
we're
Keep
adding.
it about yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, Rick,
Okay.
you know, it feels really upsetting to me when I'm not able to leave on time and pick up my kids
Yeah.
from school. That's really upsetting to my children. It's really important to me that I'm able to leave on time.
Yeah.
So there's a big difference that if I say, "Hey Rick, you always keep me here until past 5. You know I have to get my kids, and I'm always late, and you're getting me in trouble." Right? So there's a difference in the way you state things, right?
And just for the
And
record, that
you don't
does
have to
not
say it.
happen.
No, that does not happen. It's just an example.
Yeah,
Just
I
an
know.
example. So it's like there's a difference in the way you state it, and you don't have to go and be like, I'm setting some boundaries with you, because that does feel like rules. Does that feel limiting?
Oh,
There's a
totally.
very big difference in the way you state it, and you're accomplishing what you want without
Well,
getting the person triggered or feeling like they're being blamed or accused or they're the problem, right?
one is coming from a reactive level, and one's coming from a responsive level,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So if you are reactive in a low mood state, right? Yes, you're going to lash out and say, I need to set boundaries. This is ridiculous, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when you allow that to settle, when you let your snow globe settle a little bit, when you can see it clearly, if boundaries seem appropriate, great. At least you're responding at a higher level of a mindset as opposed to, being infuriated or angry or whatever level of where you're at.
Well, you're in a disempowered state of mind when
Absolutely.
you're feeling triggered, angry, and you're emotional. So, like, yes, go, and we talk about this all the time. Release the emotion, let it express. It's valid, it's there for a reason. It wants to be expressed. You don't have to do it with the person that you're going to have the conversation with. Do it on your own time in a separate setting.
Yeah.
Once the emotion is discharged, now you can have the conversation. But the other thing that's really important, that I think it's a pivotal point in whether or not boundaries work, is like, how do you feel about these guidelines that you're setting up? Do you feel that you have, do they feel right to you? Do you feel that you have the right to state those things, right? Because oftentimes the reason why we set boundaries and it didn't work, like, and that happens a lot as a parent. We'll get into that in a minute, right? So it's a little bit trickier when you're dealing with your children, because often you're not dealing with the same level of understanding, especially when they're younger, right? Sometimes you get just exhausted and you
Well,
give in, right?
and we want to keep
So
them safe.
but like when you are not firm on understanding what is right and wrong for you, right, that's when you show up and you're wishy-washy about them, you're not clear about them, you state it but then you walk it back, you say this feels right to me but then you kind of go against your own thing that you just said, like you're not being consistent with them, right? And that's confusing to others. And guess what, the reason why that is because there's confusion within you. So
Well,
always think in these terms. Always bring it back to yourself. How clear am I on this? Does it feel right? Does it not feel right? Am I questioning myself? And sometimes we intellectually understand it. It feels right. It's aligned with our values. It all the boxes are checked, but it just doesn't feel right emotionally, right?
well, that's one of the important things. Like I'm just gonna I like to draw.
Go ahead, write
Okay.
it.
So right, feelings and emotions, right?
Hmm.
So our feelings and emotions are always going up and down, always going up and down, right? And but when we set something in a low state, right? So we take action hoping for a particular result, right? In a low state. When we're in a higher state, this action, whatever it is, like whatever guideline, boundary, or rule that we set,
Hmm.
doesn't look right anymore. So,
Hmm.
so that's where I think this
I
is where it
love this
happened with the
point.
disconnect was that
Yeah.
I'm looking at it now so differently that, oh, wait a minute, that seems kind of silly. I should let that go a little bit, right? Now, my point is if I wait for this to go away, this low mood go away a little bit, right? Do whatever you need to do, like you say, and let this rise and settle. If I make my actions at this point, and wherever they look like, right,
Hmm.
I can't help but get better results,
Yeah, absolutely. I love
right?
this point that you made.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we set, I'm sorry, we're going to use the word boundaries. If I've set boundaries down
You,
here,
you seem to feel good about it now. So go ahead.
but if I set my boundaries here, and then it's like, okay, I set my boundaries. The
But
world
they
the world doesn't change. The world still is the same. But all of a sudden, I'm coming in with a better mood or a better view, whatever you want to look at it. And I've set this boundary. All of a sudden, it looks like what like whoa, that's restricted. So anyway, all I'm
it's going
saying,
to be, first of all, it's going to be a very different guideline, right? If you
it will
started
be.
when you're in a higher state of
Yeah.
being, right?
So this is just a
Yeah.
reactive place, and this is a responsive place. So
Absolutely.
yeah, so my only real point is, and I guess part of it is my reaction to boundaries comes from here,
From
right?
there, yeah.
When I settle and see it for what it really is, right? I can play with it now. I can play with it because I'm seeing it better. I'm
Yeah.
seeing it from a different point of view. Yeah. So
I
anyway.
mean, it's basics of relationships in a sense, right? And
Oh yeah,
not just personal relationships, like work relationships, right? Like we're social beings. That's
totally. We're
that's
always
what we do.
interacting. We're
We're
always
always in
interacting.
relationships,
Yeah.
right? So having some guidelines to go by that feel good for you, it's only going to serve you,
Yeah.
right? As long as it comes from a place of knowing what feels right for you, owning it, feeling good about it, not setting those guidelines from a place of anger or resentment or, like feeling like you're being limited, right? When you've come from that place, then you're going to set rules, you're going to set guidelines that are responding to the emotion, just like the point that you're making,
Yeah.
right? So that's one way to kind of create a healthy habit for yourself in terms of how you do set these guidelines, right? For yourself. Just start with yourself. What are you
Um,
writing now? Fear.
that's it. So this is
Yeah.
fear based.
Yeah.
This is all fear based, right? So when the fear settles, right, the opposite is love.
Yeah.
And when you take action from this area here, right, you cannot get you cannot help but get better results, right?
Absolutely.
So if your boundaries are set through fear, yeah, you're going to get what you get.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good place. Just you froze for a second. You gave me a low moment of PTSD. Sorry, everyone who doesn't know. A couple episodes ago, Rick just disappeared while we're talking. But there's very different weather conditions today. So, but what I was saying is like, so, be careful. Like, let's make this example because I did receive this question, right? Some
Sure,
of the
yeah,
questions were like around, how do you set boundaries around relationships? One of them is around, with your children. So we'll talk about that. But I want to talk about like boundaries at work, right?
sure.
Again, start with you. What is acceptable to me? Why, because it's always like a relationship, right? So unless someone's keeping you captive and forcing you to do something, you have some part in it. And I know that people don't love to hear this, but you always have some part in it,
Always.
right? So where is it that you're not making that clear? Where is it that you have been willing and accepting of that behavior, right? So
Hmm.
you start there. You start by recognizing that. And we're not saying this to create any sense of guilt. Guilt doesn't work ever in any situation. We're just saying this because the moment that you recognize that, you own it, now you can do something about it, because when you own something, you take your power back. You have the power to
Oh,
do something about it, right? It's
it's
not in
right.
the hands of somebody else, it's in
Yeah,
your own hands,
yeah.
right? So the moment that you own your part, you reflect, you see, okay, I'm feeling triggered, I feel overworked, I'm going to burn out, the expectations are too high, I just can't meet them, right? Instead of focusing on the expectations and what's being done to you on the outside, I would invite you to look at, okay, where was I complicit in this? Where was I accepting of this? Where did I not speak up, right? Where did I not express what is acceptable to me and what is not? And if I didn't, do I feel that I cannot? Do I feel like I may lose my job, right?
And that's
So
fear. That's fear based,
and
right?
that's fear.
Yeah,
Again, that's
yeah.
fear. So if you're in that place and now you want to go set some boundaries with your boss, don't. Simply don't, right? Because the work that needs to be done before you go, and this doesn't mean that you're not right in not wanting to
Oh,
work
you
20 hours a day.
yeah,
You
exactly.
have the right to feel that way. That's not the point. The point is the most effective way to change that situation to where you don't feel this way anymore is to start with you, right?
Yeah.
Recognizing your part and really like establishing, like making peace with it, right? Okay, this is where I allowed this. What is acceptable to me? What am I willing to do? What are even the consequences that I'm willing to accept if there will be consequences, right? But
Right.
we're not focusing on that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because what we're focusing on is to better our situation, right? To make it more comfortable for ourselves. What will make it more comfortable? So whenever you come from a place of like with that positive approach of wanting to like grow from this and learn from this, really take it as a learning lesson within yourself, then you can come up with that conversation that's going to get across. You can come
Well,
up with the points that are going to be heard, right?
and not only that, okay. And because down here is fight or flight,
Yes.
right? It's all fear based, right? So it's fight or flight. When you're in a fight or flight, the only access you have is is what you know, is your intellect, your past, right?
But the thing that you're focused on, really,
Well,
that's,
yeah, no, but I
you
mean, like,
know,
if you're looking for solutions,
yeah,
you're going to, that's the only
you're
source.
not.
What you're pointing to, is that when you're settled, right, when you're in a higher state, right, you obviously look towards better action. And a lot of things that I'm, from my experience, is here the world is very limited looking, but here there are more possibilities the higher I go.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
what ends up happening is we get access to the other half of the brain that we hardly ever use, our intuition and wisdom.
Yeah.
Something occurs to us out of the blue that is far more effective than anything we could ever come up with
Come up with.
in a fear-based world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And guess what? That possibility was always there. You
It,
just couldn't see it when you were angry, when you were resentful, when you were in the story of how this is unfair and being overworked,
yeah.
right? Yeah, you're like in the noise. You
Yeah.
cannot see beyond the pain,
Yeah.
right? Beyond the fear.
Yeah.
So it doesn't, we're not trying to say that the story is not true. Like, I want people to really understand this,
You
because
could
we're
you could
coaches, and
very
sometimes
well
we
be
tend to have
work.
conversations
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
we have that understanding that that's not what we are saying, but I want to make sure that people
Yes.
receive it that way,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We're not saying that the thing that's upsetting you is not true. We're just saying that it's not useful to react from that place of fear, anger, feeling, wronged or whatever it is, because the outcome that you're going to receive in return is going to be on the same level.
Yeah.
So always start there by really seeing the lesson in this, really seeing your part, on your part, see the lesson in this. Calm, you stop blaming, stop looking on the outside, right? The moment that you accept it for what it is, it's a situation that's uncomfortable for me,
Yeah.
not sustainable, unacceptable, whatever you want to call it, right?
Yeah.
The moment that you calm yourself and you shift into that higher state of being, now you can see more useful
Yeah.
solutions, more
Absolutely.
ideas that come out of the blue. They're not coming out of the blue. They were always there. You just couldn't see it when you were triggered, when you were focused on the problem, right? So the moment that you let go of the problem and you accept it for what it is, it's just something that makes me uncomfortable, right? Remove all the meaning. The boss is not mean, even if they are, it's not about them. Remove them, throw them out of the picture,
Yeah.
because they're just taking up space. They're just taking up mental space. Get them out of your mental space. Look at the problem more objectively, shift into a higher state of being. You don't even need anyone to help you resolve it. The solution will come to you. The out
Absolutely.
of the blue idea is not an out of the blue idea. It's just you now turning into a different direction,
And
watering your flowers instead of the weeds.
absolutely. And from that point, it's from that point that's when you start to look at, and I've heard this from other examples of us talking in the past, is you start to go, you know what, I need to set up my calendar in a way that supports me,
Absolutely. Yes.
right?
And often you find out, exactly, that's such a good point. Often you find out, you know what? I'm part of the problem.
No kidding.
I'm part of the problem. I'm not doing things that serve me. I'm not respecting my own time. I
Yeah.
am working late nights and going to bed late, or whatever it is. I'm just giving examples
Yeah.
here,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You find out when you're open to assuming some ownership to this. I
Yeah.
don't want to use the word responsibility because it's a triggering word, just like boundaries, right? So you own it, right?
Yeah.
The moment that you own some of this, then now you can look at it with a very different set of glasses, right? Now you can
Absolutely.
be like, oh, I have the power to actually
It's
control this. I
it's
can change
clear.
my calendar, I can go
Yeah.
to bed earlier, right? So I'm
Totally.
relieving some of that pressure, that discomfort already on my own.
Yeah.
And how can I go and present this from the place that feels right for me. Because guess what? No one can come to you and tell you how you feel,
No.
right? Which is why it's so important to be, this is how I feel, this is what feels right for me, and never be like, you overwork me, you keep me late, even if it's true. We're not saying that it's not true. We're just saying what works for your best interest, what's
Oh,
most
totally.
effective,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
This doesn't feel good to me. It is not something that I can, live with, or it makes me feel really exhausted. I feel that I'm not productive when, I have to work late hours all the time. And I feel that I need this to change so that I can show up more powerfully, so that I
Oh,
can do my job,
yep.
like I can have a more fair, chance to do my job better, right? However you want to phrase it,
All sorts
always
of,
bring it back to yourself.
and like, like the actions you take at the fear base, right? Like you said, you're already working 80 hours a week, kind of a thing. Yes, that's a fact. That's a fact, right? If you're coming at it from a fear base, all it could look like is I'm quitting my job,
Yeah.
right? Now, if you let that settle, it still may look like I'm quitting my job, but it looks like it's coming from a more powerful place where you're saying, okay, you know what? I need to change my job, or I may quit my job, but I'm not going to sort of like run out. Maybe I'll start looking at
What's the strategy? What's the best strategy? What's the best
exactly
exit strategy
right.
for me to
Yeah,
leave
all
this
sorts of
job,
different things
right?
start to come into play. You have a blank slate now to play with instead of all what it looks like is I have to get out of here. I have to do something, right?
Yeah,
But
because I have to get out of here. It only leads to I have to get out of here, right?
yeah,
But saying like, okay, this doesn't feel right to me. What can be a good path out? What could be first step one? What's step one? We always bring it back to small steps. Step
yeah,
one,
yeah,
have the conversation when you're not triggered, right?
sure, yeah,
Is the conversation being received? Great. Step two, try it out and speak up if it goes back to the way it was,
yeah.
right? If it's not well received, what go back to the drawing board. What's my next strategic step? Exit strategy, or whatever you want to call it,
Whatever
right?
whatever you come up with, but if you come up out of the fear state and then respond accordingly, then I guarantee you'll always get better results. You'll always get better
Well,
results.
because the truth is,
Yeah.
and it's a hard truth for all of us to accept, you can control others. You can control how they react. You can control what they do, but you can show up in a way that's going to make it more swaying your way, right? Effective communication is a thing, right? And it cannot come from a place of anger, right?
No,
It cannot come from a place of anger. So
no.
you cannot control others. When you realize that the only person you can control is yourself, and you always move from that place, start there, you're always in control. Guess what? The
Oh,
thing that you are trying to control on the outside, it's always been on the inside. It's always been in your hands,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So it's hard to make that slight mindset shift, because we feel wronged and we want to go after the person. We want to be validated for the wrongness. We want to, we want our story to be heard. And there's very healthy ways to do that. And I think that's very valid, that we want to be validated and heard, and we want to express that. And there's a way to do it that it's going to actually change your situation versus just exasperate it and create a reaction to the reaction, and not that will most likely not change the actual challenge that you're having in that moment,
No,
right?
no. And this is the other thing I like about my this model here is that you know the circumstances look very different from here to here, yet it's the same circumstance.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
so even at this level, what you thought was true here may not be true anymore. And
Absolutely.
and and you may not have to take action. You may but looking at it when this settles and when you settle it's like the beach ball, right? Like when you suppress it underneath the water, right? There's a lot of energy here that's being just, holding it down. The
Yeah.
minute you release it in whatever form you want, it'll naturally rise,
Yeah.
and you'll notice it. And when it does, when you settle, you had a, you just know, right? You just know.
It's just the difference in what you focus on, basically, right?
Absolutely.
Do you focus on the thing that's making you angry, the challenge, or do you focus on, okay, taking ownership? What have I learned from this? How can I strategize around a solution that's going to actually change my circumstances, right? Because the end goal here is to come out of suffering, right? The end goal is to change those circumstances, right? So we already established you can't control what others do. You just can control it, right? You can express it. They are going to do what they're going to do, right? And that's the ultimate human struggle, right? Expecting things from others, and not, and we can go a little more in depth into this next week, which we decided we're going to talk about relationships specifically, because that's where expectations versus agreements really come into play, right? But I do want to, before we shift out of this a little bit more, I
Yeah.
do want to talk about when are boundaries unhealthy, right? I think boundaries, and I kind of hinted at that earlier, are unhealthy when there's no leeway, when they're super rigid, when now they become the thing that you grab onto, right?
Hmm.
That you feel like that all of your safety depends on that, because guess what? Guess what's moving you to be that way? Fear,
Yeah.
right? You're
Yeah.
afraid that if I let go of this, then my world is gonna, fall apart, right? So your boundaries become so rigid that there is no like flexibility at all, right? Boundaries are set, right, based on what feels right for you. But when you interact with other people, there has to be flexibility, because then we're all living in our own, like you're saying, strict rules, right? And we start clashing with each other, right?
Yeah.
So I always say, just find your core values. What is like an absolute no go for you, right? And always stick to that. Always stay true to that, right?
Yeah.
And also use some, trust yourself that in the moment you can also choose to bend them, right? Because guess what? You're the one who made the rules. You can break them and you can bend them, right? But don't let the rules define you to the point that you depend on them, because then they become a wall around you, right? They
Well, and
become
and that
barriers.
and that's the point. I like what you're pointing to, because if it becomes an absolute, then yeah. And if I keep pushing against my boundaries, or if somebody's trying to push against my boundaries, and it's not working, it's to realize and recognize that it's not working, right? So when I recognize that, you do have a choice. You can either stick with it and see
Well,
how.
I mean, you're always checking back with yourself.
Right.
Does this feel right? Right. And also another thing to keep in mind is we're evolving every day. Whether
Yeah.
you want it or not, you're changing.
Yes.
Life will change you. You will change because you're getting older. Your experiences stack up. You're changing, right?
Oh,
And
100%.
so what feels right is going to change, right? So boundaries are absolutely not set in stone, right? It's the moment that you see them as set in stone, you see them as like, this is how I defend myself from others. Now you're putting it into the place of fear, you're putting it into a lower vibration, you're putting it into a lower state of being. You're in a lower state of mind when you have that kind of relationship with boundaries, right? It's just, I'm going to safeguard myself. Yes, boundaries and rules and guidelines keep us safe, but it's just the way you look at them that it's different. It's your flexibility with them. Again, you created them, you can bend them, you can change them. The number one rule I would say is check back with yourself. Does it still feel aligned? Does it still feel fine with me,
Does it
right?
still serve me
Does
correctly?
it still serve me in this situation? Because each situation can challenge those guidelines in a very different way, right? Maybe something presents in that moment that let's give an example. My kids going to bed at a certain time at night, like by 8:30, right? When they're young, it's really important for them, like they're going to have a hard time in school the next day. It's kind of a pretty clear rule, right? If I'm always going to be strict, now it's Christmas and I'm sticking my kids to bed at 8:30, right? Or it's New Year's Eve, or like they have grown now. Now feels like an imposed rule, right? You can't really bend this rule. I mean, so you're always looking at these rules or these guidelines that you set up against the current circumstances, the person that you're dealing with, the situation, right? You're the judge. You're the wise creator of those
Absolutely.
guidelines, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you have the freedom to make them and unmake them. But watch out that when you decide that something feels right for you, the first person that needs to stick to those guidelines is you.
Yeah. Good one. I like that. So it's not about, like you said, it's not, so this is where the word in the label gets sticky, right? Is because by true definition, it's a limit, it's limits and rules.
Mm-hmm.
I also to like what you point to is that we're evolving, and so is the world. Like they're always, it's always right. If we're going to use things that we've been using for the last 10 years and expect the same, different
That's going
results,
to apply the same exact way. Yeah, it's just
right?
not.
So
Yeah,
you got
it's
to be
just not.
current. You got to be current. Flexibility and adaptability have always been key for any species to survive, particularly adaptability. And that would be a good subject too, is to talk about how to become more adaptable, um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
to
And you know
to
what?
a
We love it
world that
when
doesn't seem to want to sit still.
it doesn't. Nothing sits still. Now is
Nothing.
gone. As I
No,
say it, right? Now
exactly.
is gone. There's not we feel safe in like keeping things the same, right? And this is a whole other conversation too,
Oh, totally.
right?
Yeah.
We like our habitual selves
Certainty.
because it
Yeah.
feels familiar, so it feels safe. But there's nothing that stands still ever.
No.
This instant is gone the instant
Yeah.
that you realize it's an instant, right?
And
So is life, right? You're constantly changing and evolving, and which is why self-development, doing the work, there's no arrival. There is
no,
no arrival
no,
with this, and I always
you're
say this to
there.
my
Yep.
clients: you're not
Yep.
arriving.
No, there's no place
It's
to
a
go.
journey that's ever evolving. You're
Yeah.
always evolving, so you're always doing the work. You're looking within yourself, you're checking in with yourself. Does it still align with me? Does it still feel right? There's no arrival. If you're doing self-development and you feel frustrated because you're not there yet, there is no there.
Well, here's,
There is you are
and
there.
if you take lessons from nature, and I know our hours up, but you know, it's the realization that I don't have the same skin I was born with.
Hell, you don't have the same skin you had a month ago.
I know that. I know that. So why would I expect to keep the same thinking over and over and over again? Right? It has to evolve too.
You know why? Because the brain loves to keep it the same because
Oh,
it has to do less work, right?
the,
It's
the
easier
brain
for
is
the
a
brain.
hoarder.
The brain loves simplicity because it makes its job easier. It's survival again. That's the way we were created and wired.
Yeah.
So
So,
that's why we
any,
like to go back to habitual thinking.
yeah. Um, yeah. So we better. I don't know if we better, but we do have a boundary about.
But see, do you see how that really doesn't apply to me? I'm like, I'm okay. Okay, we went over a couple minutes.
I know. I just, yeah, I know. But that's just our thinking, right? So it's great. We really appreciate the extra, people have been commenting, people have been sending us questions,
Questions, yeah,
and
it really
we're
helps.
going to get to them. I think next week we'll we'll touch again on this subject because it intertwines with relationship. Like
With relationships,
yeah,
yeah, there were a lot of questions around relationships, but I think it's important to understand what
yeah,
boundaries are, how
yeah,
they work,
and how they
and
show up
how
in
to,
relationships.
yeah,
Yeah,
how they show up and how to set them,
yeah,
right? Because it's not about going and like, here's my laundry list of rules that now you have to obey by, right? There's a way to set them that's healthy, that's received, that's
and
going to serve you,
yeah,
right?
and that's coming from a different place,
From a
obviously.
very different place, exactly. So it was an important conversation to just have around what boundaries are, and then of course boundaries intersect into relationships, and we'll talk about that next week.
Yeah, yeah, very good. So keep the comments, keep the messages back to us, and we'll
Let
see you
us know
next
what
week.
was helpful. Let us know
Yes,
if there's
oh yeah,
anything else you want us to
yeah,
speak to,
yeah.
and yeah, keep
We
sending us
love feedback.
messages.
We love feedback.
We love feedback. Like
Anyway,
us, follow us, come
yes,
back next week.
yes, wherever that link might be, whatever. Facebook, YouTube. We're building our YouTube tribe.
Yeah,
It's really exciting to see. And thanks everybody for coming on. And thank you for watching the recording too. And please share us with
absolutely.
others. And yeah.
Here's where we go like this, and then we stop it, and we may have to hold the pose because we don't know when it's going to stop. Bye, everyone. See you next week.
Yeah. Bye now.